So in this video we're going to look at areas of the brain, and it's worth noting before we begin that although we're going to put forward quite a simplified view of where functions are located within the brain, research in this area is constantly changing, constantly being updated, and there's an awful lot we don't know about brain function. And it is thought now that certain areas of the brain are not necessarily localized to particular functions. So you do need to know these areas, but just be aware that research is constantly changing. So starting at the very beginning, the brain is divided into two hemispheres. We've got the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and they are what are known as contralateral. Now, what contralateral means is simply that the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and processes information from the right side of the body, and vice versa. So, for example, something that you see in your left field of vision, so with your left eye, would be processed in the right hemisphere, and something that you touch maybe with your right hand, that sensory information would be processed by the left hemisphere. Similarly, if you want to move your left arm, it's the right side of your brain, the right side of the motor cortex that's processing that information and causing you to make those movements. Now, within these two hemispheres, very broadly speaking, the left hemisphere is often associated with speech and language. This is true of most people, but not everybody. And similarly, the right hemisphere is generally involved in things like recognition and spatial awareness. Narrowing it down a little bit further and looking at the lobes. So at the very front of our brain, that's the large blue bit, we have the frontal lobe. Sort of on the top towards the back, the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is right at the very back of our brain, and the temporal lobe is sort of towards the bottom. Now, the cerebellum and the brainstem, they're the most primitive parts of our brain. They're the bits which were sort of during our evolution, they were the first bits to evolve. If we look at localization within the brain, so looking at specific areas, there are two areas which have very special names, and they're to do with speech production and speech comprehension. So the first one is Broca's area, and the second one is Wernicke's area. Now, Broca's area is associated with speech production. Wernicke's area is associated with speech comprehension. So if either of those two areas are damaged, you tend to find the patients either can't find the words, can't use language correctly, or can't understand what somebody's saying. Now, this bit in the middle between the two is called the auditory cortex. So that's associated with processing information that we hear. Towards the top of our brains, we have the motor cortex, which is responsible for movement. We have the somatosensory cortex, which processes information that comes from our senses. And then towards the back in the occipital lobe, we've got the visual cortex, which processes visual information. Now, you can go and have a look at the pre-reading for a bit more detail in all of those brain areas, but make sure that before the lesson you can label a diagram of the brain with the correct regions. You can clearly explain which function each area is concerned with, and you can explain what we mean by the term contralateral.